my prior experience with the French Communist Party meant nothing, because the condition of the Communist Party of Cambodia's member was much more stringent than those of the French Communist Party. First, I had to have combative experience. I had to go through tampering and probation in the revolution back and forth. Two, I have to have good pedigree. Good pedigree was the ones who were from the peasant, and mainly from poor peasant. And my pedigree was not good because I was fellow intellectual educated in France. And in addition, I had never been tempered in the revolution. For this reason, I do not have the necessary qualification and experience to satisfy the criteria for the hardcore members of the party, end quote. And that clearly demonstrates that Mr. Khieu Samphan failed to meet the necessary criteria of the Communist Party of Cambodia. For this reason, Mr. Khieu Samphan does not have any effective power in the party. As for his position in the front and the Krung, he held senior position, but he did not have any power, as Mr. Khieu Samphan noted very clearly before this chamber, and I quote, "Why from outside people saw that I held a senior position, but in effect I did not have any effective power in decision making?" Well, it was because Pol Pot and the Communist Party of Cambodia consider me as the depositee intellectual in the Communist Party. I was not the hardcore members of the party prior to 1975, and that remained true thereafter. Mr. Philip Short, a witness expert, also testified before the chamber on the 6th of May 2013, confirming the role of Mr. Khieu Samphan. He confirmed that Mr. Khieu Samphan did not hold any position that allowed him to make any decision in his capacity as the full-fledged member of the standing committee. And Mr. Khieu Samphan was an intellectual who had never held any position at the zone. This clearly shows that Mr. Khieu Samphan received the position because of his popularity, and the Communist Party of Cambodia could make use of that popularity in order to attract attention from others. It was not because of Mr. Khieu Samphan's combative experience with the revolution. Mr. Philip Short further testified to the chamber on the 8th of May 2013 that the reason was that Khieu Samphan was placed in a position that was in the center of the power, and he also held an extraordinary position that Pol Pot wanted nobody but him to hold that position. And it can be said that Mr. Pol Pot see that Khieu Samphan was someone who could hold a number of important leadership positions. And Mr. Mieh Wun also testified before the chamber on the 9th of October 2012. He also said, and I quote, "Khieu Samphan did not do anything. He merely sought refuge in order to avoid persecution in Phnom Penh." Given these facts, Mr. Khieu Samphan could not become an effective leader. His role was confined to merely that of protocol, or even less important than this role. On the 21st of May 2013, Mr. Julian Goffreys testified before the chamber, and I quote, "Mr. Khieu Samphan at that time was single, and he did everything possible in order to develop his country by participating in various activities, and the sole purpose was to improve the living condition of the people and the economic situation of the country," end quote. Based on the above testimony of witnesses, experts, and civil parties, it is abundantly clear that Mr. Khieu Samphan is a person of gentle personality. He loves peace, he loves development, he wants to bring better welfare and development to his country. In the first few years of 1970 and 1975, when he was on the run, he lived separately in the countryside. He did not hold any position or activity in the revolutionary movement. Various sections in the closing order describing the activity of the Communist Party of Cambodia started to discuss the participation of Mr. Khieu Samphan in the structure of the party following the coup d'etat of the 18th of March 1970. On the day of the coup d'etat, both Pol Pot and Sihanouk were in Beijing. The alliance between the two leaders started over there, and Pol Pot immediately saw the advantages of expanding a revolutionary movement by making use of the prince's popularity, and in so doing, Pol Pot knew that Khieu Samphan would be the right person to be a focal point of contact for Samdech Sihanouk. Khieu Samphan received the information of his appointment in the forest, Maki Forest. Mr. Khieu Samphan testified before the chamber on the 13th of December 2011 that, and I quote, "I received the position as Deputy Prime Minister of Nasing, Minister of National Defense of Nasing, and Commander-in-Chief of Nasing. As a matter of fact, I had no effective power and influence, even the slightest, on the army. I did not have a single office subordinate to me. On the contrary, I sacrificed everything, including my personal esteem and personal reputation, in order to fulfill my obligation and duty for my motherland, which is on the verge of collapse." And he further testified that what he wanted was to unite the forces, national forces, following the devastating war in Cambodia as a consequences of the fighting between the superpower. He testified before the chamber on the 27th of May 2013 that, and I quote, "Following the coup d'etat, I simply wanted to unite the national forces in order to struggle to liberate our country. Following the coup d'etat, the war in Vietnam broke out, and it spilled over into our territory. The superpower country were fighting in South Vietnam, and then it spilled over into our territory. Your Honors, the war in Cambodia between 1970 to 1975 has the nature of a regional war. It was not a civil war per se. The first bombardment on the Cambodian soil in 1967 only grew bigger following the Vietnam War in 1968, and it then became the war in Indochina. And this war had the international nature. It was very clear following the 18th of March 1970 as the result of the Cold War ideology. On the 23rd of July 2012, Professor David Chandler testified that, quote, "It was the element of war with Vietnam. Vietnam did not consider it a war against Vietnam, but it was viewed as the regional war," end quote. Therefore, the war by foreign forces who were fighting on the territory of Cambodia pushed Cambodia into plunged Cambodia into the devastating war. The bombardment of the American forces on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and the bombardment of Viet Cong was intensifying in Cambodian land. Mr. David Chandler said, and I quote, concerning the war in Vietnam, concerning Vietnam and the United States in 1933, in 1973, rather, it was the year that the bombardment intensified, and that was the war that was spilled over from the Vietnam War. And these bombardments and conflict caused a lot of problems to Cambodia. And the government of the United States supported Ronald government, which was its allied, in order to dismantle the Khmer Rouge forces. And this turned into the regional war in this region. Mr. Al Rockoff testified before the chamber on the 29th of January 2013 that the American bombardment helps the government of Cambodia then. And Cambodian government back then relied heavily on America. The Cambodian air forces were very weak, so the government could not rely on its Air Force capability. On the 9th of April 2013, before the chamber, Mr. Pongsho also confirmed the invasion in Cambodia from the Communist Party, Communist military of Vietnam. And he said, at that time, Vietnamese military, Communist Vietnam, and North Vietnam's invaded Cambodia, and they arrested youth, and they created the Cambodian Liberation Forces. That was the reason why Mr. Khieu Samphan received the position in the front and the Krung government. And Mr. Khieu Samphan's sole purpose was to defend his national independence and territorial integrity. And Mr. Khieu Samphan was willing in this respect to be the representative and the bridge for the relation between Samdech Sihanouk, who was in Beijing at the time, with the Communist Party of Cambodia, who has the ability to resist in the country. He wanted to unite the forces in order to defend Cambodia that was independent, sovereign, and in order to salvage Cambodia. He envisioned that the alliance between Samdech Sihanouk and Communist Party Cambodia would form a new movement that could be successful in reunifying the country. Mr. Khieu Samphan viewed that he was a person who could be the bridge between the Communist Party of Cambodia and Samdech Sihanouk, and he could unite the two leaders. For this reason, Mr. Khieu Samphan stepped forward to hold some position in the resistance forces in the country, even though he was discontented with this position of nothing. Given the pressing circumstances before him, Mr. Khieu Samphan had no choice, but he had to choose to unite the country first, and he had to sacrifice himself, even though it was shameful for him to receive the position of nothing. Now, Your Honors, I would like to invite you to examine the reason why Mr. Khieu Samphan was brought to the discussion among the leaders to hold this gigantic position in the new movement of Krung and Phung. That was because Cambodian people were loyal to Samdech Sihanouk, and Mr. Khieu Samphan was considered as a corruptless person. So these were the positive converging point for the Khmer Rouge forces. Mr. Philip Short testified before the chamber on the 6th of May 2013 by confirming that Samdech Sihanouk was the chairman of the revolutionary forces, and Mr. Khieu Samphan was recognized widely as a person who is loyal, honest, and Samdech Sihanouk received support from the Khmer Rouge, and he was leading the resistance forces against the Lon Nol regime. So Mr. Khieu Samphan was best placed in the position to reconcile Cambodian leaders at that time. Mr. Khieu Samphan's reputation was a positive point for the two leaders. Mr. Philip Short also testified that the popularity of Samdech Sihanouk among the Cambodian people reinforced the movement of the Khmer Rouge, and as a result, the Khmer Rouge could recruit soldiers very quickly following the appeal by Samdech Sihanouk following the coup d'etat. The carpet bombardment by the American forces and the problems that occurred during the Lon Nol administration also expedite the participation of Cambodian people in the revolutionary forces. From the inception of Phung and the appointment of Mr. Khieu Samphan as a public representative of the revolutionary movement, he held this position ever since. And following that, he went to meet Pol Pot in the headquarters in Ratanakiri. Over there, he was willing to sacrifice himself for the front, and he saw a lot of advantages beyond the communist ideology. And he responded to one of the civil party on the 30th of May 2013, who asked him, he said, and I quote, he wanted to mobilize national forces in order to fight in the war at that time. In this context, Mr. Khieu Samphan was appointed the position of the deputy chairman of Phung, the commander-in-chief of Phung, as well as deputy prime minister and defense minister for Krung. In the list of those nominal positions, and on the occasion of the third Congress of the Communist Party of Cambodia, which was held in the jungle in 1971, Mr. Khieu Samphan then became the candidate member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Cambodia. It was for this same political reason that Mr. Khieu Samphan continued to assume the position that Samdech Sihanouk resigned, and he was promoted to the position of the president of the state presidium, and then he became the full right member of the Central Committee in March 1976. As a matter of fact, this appointment had nothing to do with Mr. Khieu Samphan's performance or loyalty in the party, but it was the purely strategic appointment. Actually, Mr. Khieu Samphan did not have any political or military responsibility. Krung was a powerless government. The effective power was in the hand of the Standing Committee, and this power remained with the Standing Committee until the demise of the Khmer Rouge regime. The principle of utmost secrecy in the Khmer Rouge movement was confirmed by all the witnesses testifying before this chamber. They said it was very important to maintain utmost secrecy during the entire period of the Democratic Cambodia period. For these reasons, there were code numbers assigned to offices, and people were given code names and revolutionary names in order to avoid being recognized. And they included some of the fake actors in order to confuse those who try to trace their activity. And behind the scene, Pol Pot was the only person who had the entire discretion to lead the movement of the revolution as he wished. Mr. Philip Short also confirmed this fact. On the 6th of May 2013, Mr. Philip Short testified before the chamber that the security issue and protocol issue between 1970 and 1975 was within the portfolio of Mr. Khieu Samphan. And he testified that when he was living in the forest, he could not move around freely. And he further testified that Mr. Khieu Samphan at that time was merely a nominal leader for the Communist Party of Cambodia with the position of the commander-in-chief. But at that time, between 1973 and 1974, he became a candidate member of the party. However, he did not stay close to the Central Committee. Neither did he have any position that enabled him to make any decision. At that time, he was a person whom Pol Pot trusted because he was receptive and he accepted the order when he was told to do. But at that time, he was in a situation of pressing security concern. And on the 9th of May 2013, Mr. Philip Short also recognized the content in his book entitled Pol Pot, Anatomy of a Nightmare, ERN in French 00639455-256, and ERN in English 00369197-98. He discussed the popularity of Mr. Khieu Samphan, that Cambodian people and foreigners alike supported him, and they believed that this revolution led by Khieu Samphan would be successful. And he further confirmed that Mr. Khieu Samphan, I quote, issued a statement describing the detailed information and progress of the war, and he also describes the alliance with Samdech Sihanouk. And Khieu Samphan received Samdech Sihanouk in the liberation zone. But this was only for a short period of time, and this position of the effective power was actually in the hands of other individuals. He did not have any control over whatever he did because the effective power was in the leadership of the Communist Party of Cambodia. Mr. Khieu Samphan, in reality, had never held any military position before and after 1975. As a pure intellectual, he did not have any ability, capacity, or prior training in relation to military strategy or military command. All witnesses and experts who knew about the military hierarchy confirmed that Son Sen and Pol Pot were the only leaders who were responsible for military, not Mr. Khieu Samphan. On the 10th of January 2013, Mr. Ong Ran testified before the chamber on the military structure, and I quote, Son Sen was the superior, and Pol Pot was also the superior in military. They reported on political and military issue. They were the only two main actors of the party. On the 11th of January 2012, Nuon Chea also confirmed before the chamber about the military structure. He asserted that, and I quote, this issue has nothing to do with Mr. Khieu Samphan, because Mr. Khieu Samphan was not in the military, and I myself was only the chairman of the People Assembly. But Son Sen was the chief of staff. So on the 28th of March 2012, Dutch also confirmed before the chamber that the role of Khieu Samphan as the commander-in-chief was only nominal, and I would like to assert that it was only nominal a position. As a matter of fact, he did not have any effective command over the military. Military was under the direct command of Pol Pot. Before and after 1975, no military personnel ever testified against Mr. Khieu Samphan, and nobody had ever testified that Khieu Samphan was in the position of command in the military. Mr. Stephen Hadder, who received information from intelligence agencies who were present in Cambodia, also confirmed that before the attack on Phnom Penh, Solotso was the commander-in-chief in the military hierarchy of the Khmer Rouge movement. Mr. Khieu Samphan, Hu Yun, Hu Nam were considered the nominal leaders. Mr. Steve Hatter further asserts that the role was merely nominal for Mr. Khieu Samphan. And Steve Hatter testified before the chamber on the 17th of July 2013, confirming that Mr. Khieu Samphan did not have any effective power. Steve Hatter also confirmed that prior to 1975, Khieu Samphan was the Deputy Prime Minister, the Commander-in-Chief, which were only symbolic because Pol Pot was the effective commander, and he, whenever he traveled overseas, Ieng Sary was the one who was vested with power, and Mr. Khieu Samphan was the head of delegation, but effectively, whenever Mr. Ieng Sary was there, he was the one who had the effective power. In his book, Mr. David Chandler, entitled Brother Number One, on page 87, Mr. David Chandler wrote, and I quote, "The decision to form a national front with Sihanouk as chief of state had two effects on Solotso's career. One was that after 7 years on the run, he became, at 45, the military commander of the Cambodian communist component of a popular alliance. And following the coup d'etat by Lon Nol, Khieu Samphan followed the Khmer Rouge leaders from one location to another. But even in Ratanagiri and other bases, other testimony confirmed that Mr. Khieu Samphan was an ordinary person. He merely read and wrote anything by himself and separately from others. I would like to recall on this point that on the 22nd of April 2013, Mr. Chukren testified before the chamber that his direct superior Tamok convened a meeting with his subordinate, telling that Mr. Khieu Samphan had no effective power in the Communist Party of Cambodia. They said that, quote, intellectual was not the hardcore member of the Communist Party of Cambodia, end quote. And he further said that he was a nominal leader with no effective power. Mr. Chukren also testified further that, and I quote, Mr. Khieu Samphan was an intellectual who was outside the party rank, end quote. On the 23rd of April 2013, Chukren testified further on his role that Khieu Samphan between 1973 to 1975, he listened to Tamok, who told him the following, and I quote, Khieu Samphan was an intellectual. He did not participate in the core forces of the Communist Party of Cambodia, end quote. And I would like to now, Your Honours, raise a few points in relation to the training session conducted by Mr. Khieu Samphan in the forest. As a matter of fact, there was only one single witness who testified on this point. That was Mr. Pipun, who described the presentation by Mr. Khieu Samphan concerning the necessity to garner forces as much as possible and concerns the importance of the National Front. Mr. P. Pun described before the Chamber on the 25th of July 2013, the content of the speech delivered by Mr. Khieu Samphan and disseminated in the name of the National United Front of Cambodia and his training session for the front. He testified that, and I quote, "The National Front forces, to my recollection, had the following mandate. One, to mobilize intellectual forces, and then gradually mobilize the national forces to transform it into one united national force," end quote. Therefore, Your Honor, even though Mr. Khieu Samphan either conducted this training or not, the content of his training was merely to unite national forces across the country in order to strengthen the National United Front of Cambodia. Your Honors, as have been presented on this point, there is no single document, neither was there any testimony that confirmed to the contrary the effective role of Mr. Khieu Samphan at that time. Of course, Mr. Khieu Samphan has been painted the picture to be the devil, but actually Mr. Khieu Samphan was a clean, honest person, and I only hope for this chamber to find the fact behind this, and I hope that you will bring justice for Mr. Khieu Samphan, and the justice for Mr. Khieu Samphan is that he is released and acquitted.
Bonjour à la Chambre, bonjour.
Good morning to this chamber and to all of the parties and persons present in the courtroom and in the public gallery. I'm going to take up from where my learned colleague Kong Sam-on left off to talk to you about some of the preconceived ideas that we have heard from the prosecution bench in the last few days, and without wishing to repeat what has already been said by the non-chair team, we will make some remarks about Twelpo Chray and the policy that is supposed to have lain behind it. I'd like to talk first about what I would call the theory of the Iron Curtain. And the prosecution describes the 17th of April 1975 as being the date when an Iron Curtain fell across Cambodia. They are rather fond of this kind of metaphor. It's rather as if, after having lived in the jungle for more than 10 years, hiding in the trees and living in makeshift camps built out of bamboo and banana leaves, Pol Pot suddenly came out of his lair along with his old classmates and his shoeless freedom fighters, and in a few hours transformed an entire nation into a hyper-centralized territory, hyper-organized, with a unified army obeying its orders, fully operational officials, highly developed communication technologies that were effective and worked well. We would plead that this whole vision is extremely simplistic and no sensible person can really believe in it. As the proverb says, Rome wasn't built in a day, and it's clear that the zones that already had been liberated in Cambodia functioned without Pol Pot for quite a long time, and they were led by people who had no doubts whatsoever about their own leadership qualities. So this whole theory of the Iron Curtain that fell across Cambodia on the 17th of April 1975 is also mistaken from a diplomatic standpoint. Of course, it is true that when they got into Phnom Penh, the Khmer Rouge sent home the few remaining foreigners who had stayed there despite many warnings. But what might we have heard if they had been sent into the paddy fields? Does this necessarily mean that the Khmer Rouge cut off all diplomatic relations with the entire world? No, it doesn't. They maintained relations with friendly communist countries and with the non-aligned countries, and the case file contains a good amount of information on this, in particular regarding visits by foreign delegations. Just to quote a few of these, in 1975, there were visits to Cambodia by delegations from Vietnam, North Korea, Yugoslavia, Laos, Albania, and several friendly countries for the end-of-year festivities. In 1976, there was China, Palestine, Zambia, Sweden, Tunisia, Afghanistan, Senegal, Mauritania, Yugoslavia, Vietnam, Korea, Mali, and Tanzania, all of whom paid visits to Cambodia. In 1977, you have China, Cuba, Yugoslavia, Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Burma. In 1978, Finland, Denmark, Sweden, China, Yugoslavia, Romania, and Algeria. And in fact, right up to March 1976, Prince Sihanouk continued to receive diplomatic delegations in his capacity as President of the Presidium. The record of the Standing Committee of the 8th of March 1976 refers to this. In October 1975, for example, Sihanouk was in New York, and we saw that last week on the video that was projected in the courtroom. Similarly, the minutes of the Standing Committee, assuming they are authentic, contain quite a lot of information about this diplomatic activity. It's not the kind of diplomacy of a major developed countries, but it's certainly not non-existent either. It's important to stress this because of his duties at the head of Grunk and Funk and in the Presidium, Khieu Samphan did participate in this development of Cambodian democracy. It was a kind of reality for him. And when we look at the thesis that has been developed in this room by the prosecution, the impression one gets is that after the 17th of April 1975, the Khmer Rouge simply went into the wrong side in the Cold War, the Reds' side. And the prosecution can't accept this. As far as they're concerned, as soon as a country refuses to align itself, as soon as it shuns aid from the United States, that proves that it has diabolical intent. But China and the USSR, did they accept this kind of loaded aid when they set themselves up politically? I strongly doubt it. What is more, can we say that the Democratic Kampuchea regime refused all assistance to enclose itself in a kind of criminal self-sufficiency? No, it's not true. Let me refer you to the 9 first minutes of the Standing Committee that we have available to us, and you will see that the first 5, more than half, talk about the question of aid from abroad. For example, E3/781, which looks at the mastery and implementation of the political line and the reconstruction of the economy in 1975. Here this refers to foreign aid. It says that Korea is going to be offering a motor manufacturing factory and assistance with hydroelectric technologies. China is going to help restart big cement factories, refineries and rubber factories. And the Chinese are also going to be helping with getting the railroad system starting again. In E3/182 of the 9th of October 1975, there's reference to Chinese assistance laying telephone lines. In E3/229 of the 22nd of February 1976, there is reference to Chinese aid. In E3/230 of the 22nd of February 1976, there is a reference to a $3 million grant from Yugoslavia, which is going to be used to buy antiviral drugs and serums. It also refers to assistance from China for rice, and that rice is going to be distributed to the neediest regions. And lastly, this is my last example, in E3/238 of the 28th of February 1976, there's a reference to $5 million grant from the Swedish government and $4 million from the Yugoslav government. The two grants will be used to purchase materials and medicines for the population. So if you take these examples, what you can see is that what is actually happening here is that the countries whose aid is accepted by Cambodia are not the countries the prosecution would like them to be. And that is why we would like to dwell on the enormous importance of the whole context of the Cold War, which went on right up to 1989, in other words, more than 10 years after the collapse of the Democratic Kampuchea regime. Because if you forget the basic circumstance of this silent global conflict, you don't understand the entire case file. And that is why we believe that we are not entirely wrong when we say that the theory of the file as developed by the investigating judges and today by the prosecution amounts to asking you to judge these accused for having wanted to set up a communist regime in Cambodia. That was already pretty clear in the initial closing order before the severance, and it became even more obvious with the more recent theory of the prosecution on the slave camp. The investigating judges at least had the intellectual honesty to concede that the Democratic Kampuchea policies were not entirely criminal, quote unquote. The new theory of the prosecution about the nationwide slave camp in a severed case file, nevertheless, does show to what extent the way this file is being handled is often more political than legal. Coming back to this supposed iron curtain that Khieu Samphan would have helped to bring down over Cambodia, on the other side of this room, you are told that through his participation in preparing a constitution for democratic Kampuchea and organizing elections in March 1976 for a national assembly that wasn't very national and wasn't much of an assembly, Khieu Samphan contributed to the facts before us. But this is quite a feeble line of reasoning. Do you know many communist countries which endowed themselves with a constitution and a national assembly in the way the ancient Greeks would have defined it? No. And even in between 1975 and 1979, nobody is fooled by this. But what does this prove about Khieu Samphan's contribution to phases 1 and 2 of the false movements of the population and the day of Tolpo Chray? Not very much. In fact, nothing at all. Can I take your attention now to the importance of chronology in this file? It's very important, this, because the facts before you took place before the start of the regime. The evacuation of Phnom Penh took place over a few days after the 17th of April 1975. Twelpo Chre was only one day in April 1975. And as to phase 2 of the population movement decided in August 1975, well, that was implemented after September 1975, and so far it has been agreed to consider that this covered a series of population movements which continued up to the end of 1976. The question of the young age of the regime that I spoke about earlier is therefore very important. For example, in the northwest, where people were moved to in the second phase, was a region that was run by the forces of the Khmer Republic up to the 17th of April 1975, which could have had quite a few consequences from the organizational standpoint. And so the questions of the chronological timelines are very important to understand the way events unfolded. There can be no doubt that the internal and organizational situation in Cambodia was not the same between April and June 1975 and the end of 1976. The situation was still less identical in 1977 or 1978, especially after a war began to be waged with Vietnam. And when we look at the thesis put forward by the prosecution, the problem we meet is that they are asking you to imagine that the dossier had never been severed, and to believe that the description of democratic Cambodia at the end of the regime is equally applicable to April 1975, and that is obviously wrong, and it is an affront to human and historical logic of the most elementary kind, and that is why you should not validate it and be very careful to date the descriptions that have been made to you by the prosecution. The question of dates is also vital in appreciating the intention and contribution of Mr. Khieu Samphan. These elements must be appreciated on the basis of facts and not using hypothetical reasoning rooted in subsequent events that are not necessarily even established as fact. Let me give you one example. The first minutes of the Standing Committee that your tribunal has, assuming it's authentic, is the minutes of the visit of the Standing Committee to the Northwest Zone from the 20th to the 24th of April 1975. And this document talks about the need of increasing the workforce in the fertile region of the Northwest. This document marks the beginning of the second population movement phase. Now, when this August 1975 visit took place, Khieu Samphan was not only on a diplomatic trip abroad, but more than 4 months had gone by since Twelpo Chre and the evacuation of Phnom Penh, which had been over since a long while. So, taking the chronology, by August 1975, 2 of the 3 facts that are before us have already been decided and implemented. As for the third fact, it was decided on a visit that everybody is absolutely certain Khieu Samphan didn't participate in, since he was abroad, and nobody contests that. So we could almost complete our study on the role of Khieu Samphan at the stage where my learned colleague Khieu Samphan has closed his statement. In August 1975, the themes of the Standing Committee, the negotiation of a constitution, organisation of elections, accession to the Central Committee as a fully fledged member, which, as we see it, has to be juxtaposed with the question of accession to the State Presidium, the question of the succession of Dön to Office 870, are all subjects that are peripheral, because all come after the events that we are dealing with. And that's why we denounce the prosecution strategy, which is to drown us in a massive heap of documents with 2,900 footnotes that themselves refer to between 10 and 15,000 documents, which we have to go and consult. In other words, simply drowning us under a massive avalanche of documents. And in addition to expanding the scope of this trial, the prosecution is also very adept at turning events to their advantage. The example of the Standing Committee is extremely edifying. This committee met 1 to 2 times per week during the entire duration of the regime, in other words, about 50 to 100 times a year, and therefore between 190 and 380 times during the 3 years and 8 months of the democratic Kampuchea regime. And everybody confirms that Khieu Samphan wasn't a member of this Standing Committee, which is at the very centre of power around the person of Pol Pot. But on the grounds that during their preliminary investigations, the prosecutors and investigating judges only found about 20 copies of the minutes concerning these meetings, and out of that 20 copies of minutes discovered, we don't really know where, Khieu Samphan appears to have attended about 15 meetings. Without any kind of embarrassment, we are told that the archives proves that Khieu Samphan attended many meetings of the Standing Committee, and not even trying to make a joke, the other day the prosecution told us that Khieu Samphan had attended 86% of the meetings of the Standing Committee, of which we had some kind of record. Well, the truth behind this manipulation, ladies and gentlemen, and the most elementary logic dictates that Khieu Samphan appeared in about 4% of the probable number of the meetings, or rather the minutes of the meetings of the Standing Committee during the entire duration of the regime. If we want to be honest, that is the truth behind this issue. Moreover, as we pointed out in paragraphs 272 and 273 of our final submission, each time Khieu Samphan attended a meeting of the Standing Committee, the subject under discussion was always connected with one of the roles which he held in the regime, whether it was as a representative of the front and the royal government, whether it was as the person in charge of price lists and commerce, as president of the State Presidium, or as a member responsible for examining the merchandise that had to be purchased or looking at banking problems. So the truth about the Standing Committee is that if Khieu Samphan had, as we are told from the other side of the room, the full trust of Pol Pot, he would have become a member of the Standing Committee. Well, that never happened. From these different facts, one is inclined not to look at the prosecution arguments in the same way. You have to remember that if our ideas may seem a little disconnected as we plead, it is because we're trying to respond to an accusation, a prosecution thesis that is equally disjointed. There is very little direct proof in this dossier, but that is not the fault of the defense. Khieu Samphan has been waiting behind bars to be judged for the last 5 years, and at the age of 82, he has the right to expect a conclusion. As regards the intention and contribution by Khieu Samphan, the events that we are asked to judge are not proved in fact. They are not proved in essence. They are blurred by a fog of suppositions, such as, I quote, Given the roles that Kyosompon had, even several years after the fact, he could not know what had happened previously. And since he stayed with Pol Pot for the entire duration, that shows that he was entirely in agreement with everything that happened, end of quote. This is the kind of structure of most of the reasoning put before us by the prosecution. Well, you will have understood me. I'm afraid we are well short of reasonable doubt and pertinent proof. This is complete doubt and absence of evidence. And that's why we are opposed to the idea that this tribunal has some kind of historic mission. This notion pollutes the debate and tempts everybody to look for explanations for facts outside the scope of the trial. It is because the prosecution is perfectly well aware of the weakness of its arguments that it is obliged to claim that ever since the 1950s, Kyosompon was a kind of Kampuchea Communist Party puppet. He was a communist thirsting for totalitarian power, only dreaming of enslaving his people in order to transform Cambodia that he loves so much and to which he has devoted his life, to a nationwide slave camp. Well, you can say what you like, but this description is not only in total contradiction with the contradictions, the commitment, the political career and the personality of Kyosompon, but also it doesn't correspond to the evidence that we've been looking at over the last 2 years of trial and which my learned colleague Kong Samon has just talked about. It would, however, have been interesting to hear the prosecution explaining to us when and for what reasons Kyosompon gradually or suddenly became this abject being that is described to us. What particular event triggered the transformation of this man? The prosecution doesn't tell us this. You are supposed to be happy with a mere caricature here. The reasoning is even more tenuous when you look at the supposed role as a leader that Kyosompon had within the party. Not only was Kyosompon not a member of the Standing Committee, but I also remind you that he only became a fully fledged member of the Central Committee in 1976, this committee that only met once a year, and that his accession to that membership must be connected to the fact that he was succeeding Sihanouk to the Presidium in a pure representative post, without executive power. Then there's also the notorious Office 870, and my learned colleague Antagise will say a word about that. At a first stage, the prosecution was telling us that Kyosompon succeeded Dun in February 1977 here. Since having realized that in February 1977 none of the facts concerned this trial, they then switched and said, oh, but this was well before. Look at the evidence, gentlemen, on the prosecution bench. Read the minutes of the Standing Committee of the 9th of October 1975, and you will see yourselves. Who was appointed head of the political office of 870? It was Dun. Who became leader of Office 870? It was Yem. And not only 90% of the arguments of the prosecution on the contributions and the intention of Kyosompon are outside the scope of the trial, but also when you look at the definition of the roles that Kyosompon is supposed to have played through the documents of that time and through testimony, you can see that the prosecution is constantly distorting the meaning of the evidence we're hearing.
Ils n'ont pas hésité, par exemple.
They did not hesitate, for instance, to invent a new organ of the CPK. I will talk about the organ which we recently discovered, referred to as the party center. This organ, quite simply, does not exist. The term may have appeared in some articles of the revolutionary flag, but it does not exist anywhere in the statutes of the CPK. As Mr. Heder had said regarding Office 870, it is as if you are talking of Washington to describe the center of power in the United States. The problem is that not only does the prosecutor invent this organ, they even name members. And among these members, Mr. Kyo Sampan is considered as being at the top of the list. It would take time and a lot of work to show how they're trying to stifle the reality. And that is why we've asked for time, and that is why we've asked for a translation of the prosecution's closing briefs. For the past 18 days, we've not yet seen the translation, and we are not satisfied with that situation, of course. In the same vein as we've seen with the invention of this organ referred to as a party center, we also find ourselves faced with the same creativity on the part of the prosecution as they claim that Kyo Sampan was responsible for what was happening in that new organ, that is the party center. That is the application of the principle of democratic centralism, according to the prosecution, who are indulgent with the communists that were power hungry. In this party center, the Khmer Rouge took their decisions collegially. Two experts, Shorts and Chandler, testified during this trial on this subject. Now, their conclusions are different. Chandler stated that, according to him, decision-making in the standing committee was collegial. Of course, he was referring to the standing committee, and Mr. Kyo Sampan was not a member of that committee. Now the prosecution talks of a new organ, the party center, and Chandler, for his part, says that decisions were taken in the standing committee in a collegial manner, contrary to the situation in the past. And Short, on the contrary, said that decisions were taken by a very small internal circle, inner circle, and Kyo Sampan was not a member of that inner circle. So we can discuss the analysis of what these experts said. The prosecution doesn't do that, and he says that Chandler was more credible than Short on this score. And we think that such a reflection is not haphazard. Chandler had said that he no longer did research. He had no longer done research on democratic Kampuchea since 1990. And that Short's biography was better than his. Chandler said that as time went on, many more things were discovered on democratic Kampuchea. He even pointed out that he had just read in his hotel room, which he referred to profusely, the closing order, and that he would have liked to see those elements in the course of his research. However, in the 18th and 19th of July 2012 hearing, Chandler asked whether the transcript of the meeting of the 30th of March 1976 was a decision of Pol Pot or the decision of the whole group, taken collegially. He wrote, I read a few documents, and it appears to me that the leadership was more collective than I had thought. And later on he says, and I quote, I would say that after all the evidence I have read since then, the leadership was more collective than I had observed in the documents I had read relating to that era. On the 8th of May 2013, almost a year later, the prosecution puts this new opinion to Short. And this is what he says, and I quote, "I know what new elements Chandler may have unveiled. Had I known about them, my opinion would have been different, perhaps. After the interviews I conducted and the documents I read, I had the impression that there was a semblance of collective decision-making which Pol Pot manipulated. He manipulated them in order that his decisions would be accepted by everyone. But the decisions taken were fundamentally those of Pol Pot." End of quotes. We therefore see clearly, as we study the two experts' positions, that the prosecution's theory is based on Chandler's statements, who stopped doing research since 1990, and who, upon his arrival in Phnom Penh, and while he said this to the chamber, he read the closing order in his hotel room. And then we have Mr. Short, who continued his research up to a later date, who says that he didn't understand the sources of the new theory by Chandler. These are examples of the kind of evidence that the prosecution clings to, and they always try to fish evidence here and there, and they do not take into consideration contradictions, and they try to say this expert should be more credible than the other. Now, this lack of debate harms the search for the truth. This is unquestionable. I would like to say a word regarding the facts regarding Tupo Shre, which, according to the prosecution, were carried out as part of a policy to eradicate the former members of the Khmer Republic, a policy that gave rise to a widespread and systematic attack, with Tupo Shre being one of the execution sites. Tupo Shre is in Persat, about 190 kilometers from Phnom Penh. I said at the beginning that I'll try to avoid repeating what my learned friend, my learned colleague of the Nyonchia defense team said. But I'll go to the root of the matter. Tupo Shre is viewed as the root of the matter. You did not hear any witnesses before this chamber who witnessed a single murder committed in Tupo Shre. The two former Khmer Rouge soldiers who appeared before this chamber were 10 to 15 kilometers from Tupo Shre at the time of the alleged events. The first soldier was a guard who mounted guard outside of the meeting point in Persat. As for the second soldier, he said he was about 10 kilometers, 8 to 10 kilometers from Tupo Shre. That was his position. And he explained that one of his military colleagues who listened to the military radio told him that he had heard a report of gunshots on the radio. We heard a third witness, who was also a former soldier, but he was on the other side, on the side of the Khmer Republic. He said he attended two previous meetings in Persat, some kilometers from Tupo Shre. At the end of the meeting, he didn't go on board the truck going to Tupo Shre, and he waited for 2 hours with some 30 other persons to wait for some other comrades who were going to join them, and finally they didn't come, and he went back home. We've also pleaded the superficial nature of the report of the co-investigating judges. They claim that they went to the former site of Tupo Shre, even though they may have seen some shells on the ground. Since 1974, there had been violent fighting in Tupo Shre, so those shells could have dated back to that period. On the 19th of April 2013, one of the three witnesses, Unchat, testified before this chamber and told the chamber that, according to him, Persat province was captured only on the 19th of April 1975. Sum Alat, a former Khmer Republic soldier, also said that after the Khmer Republic was defeated in Persat, the Khmer Republic army continued to function. He also said that even after the fall of the Lon Nol regime, soldiers of the Khmer Republic continued to move about in uniform in that region. He also refers to some kind of resumption in the hostilities after the capture of Phnom Penh, and that people were called upon on the radio to lay down their weapons. I am only providing some leads for reflection. I could also underscore some aspects of Lim Sat's statement, one of the three witnesses, who was commander of the Khmer Rouge platoon in the region, and he said that Khmer Rouge soldiers committed killings in Tuplo-Shre, and that those soldiers were subsequently sent to S-21 for having betrayed Angkar. This point was not delved into, be it during investigations or before the chamber, but it casts doubt on the charge made by the prosecution that the massacre was ordered by the Khmer Rouge. I would also like to lay emphasis on the fact that none of the three witnesses who testified before this chamber provided any consistent evidence before this chamber, whether we are talking of the day of the meeting in Persat, the number of meetings that were held in Persat to prepare for the murderous transfer to Pochre, whether we are talking of the dates of the meetings, the duration of those meetings, and the number of participants at those meetings, the civilian or military functions of the participants at those meetings, the fact whether or not they were all wearing uniforms, or whether they were in civilian attire, or whether it was a mixture of civilians and soldiers, whether all the participants at those meetings could have entered the provincial office hall or other state outside, whether they all arrived at the meeting in this mode of transportation or not, and how they left, what was the model of the car, the color of the trucks that supposedly took participants at those meetings to Pochre. On all these issues, by the way, given the fact that these witnesses were 10 to 15 kilometers from the meeting venue, all these statements contradict one another. These statements are also not plausible because of internal contradictions, and we will not be able to point out all of them because we do not have enough time. We have to also bear in mind that there is a lack of probative evidence, no expert opinions expressed, no reports are provided. So we cannot rely on the statements given by individuals who did not even attend those meetings. It is clear that the prosecution has not shown proof of the essence of the massacres in Pochre. We have to look at what the two experts who studied the Khmer Rouge regime and the chain of command in the Khmer Rouge. We observe that it is not easy to pin down the chain of command. The Khmer Rouge soldiers were aged 23 at the time, and they said that they did not receive any instructions from their superiors regarding that meeting. They did not know whether any plan had been drawn up in advance. They even said that the only plans they were aware of regarding the former Lone Nol troops were merely instructions regarding solidarity with a view to reconstructing the country. Lim Chat, the head of the Khmer Rouge platoon, stated that he received orders from the Khmer Rouge to bring former Lone Nol troops to meet in Persat. And in spite of the attempts to influence his testimony by the prosecution, he said that he did not know at the time whether that meeting was supposed to be a preparatory stage to prepare for the massacres. The prosecutor, by the way, asked whether the leaders said from what level of the hierarchy they received their orders. Lim Sat's answer was no. They never said it. Later on, at 10 a.m., Lim Sat confirms that he was not at all aware of any policies to kill former Khmer Rouge officials and soldiers, and he stated, and I quote, "At the time they assembled those people, the police officers and soldiers, but I did not know that they were assembling them to kill them. I was mounting guard on the road and I saw trucks." End of quote. Now, under these circumstances, how did the prosecution plead that Khieu Samphan was responsible for the massacres at Tu Po Shrey? How did they get by such a conclusion? Quite obviously, they said that in spite of the incoherencies that I've just described, the massacres at Tu Po Shrey are proven. This is a first stage that I would call a first leap towards legal error. The next stage is that the prosecution, instead of passing through the door, they jump out through the window. Furthermore, they did not prove the implementation of the policies, and they said there was a general policy to kill all former Khmer Republic soldiers and officials. So they tried to prove from the top what they were unable to prove at the root. And they tried to invent in the style of Jacques Prévert, and this is a famous French poet whose poems are in the form of enumerations. The prosecution gives a list of a whole mesh of arguments, a labyrinth of arguments in which we are lost. One, in April 1975, Khieu Samphan made numerous statements on the part of the Funk and the Gronk, designating the 7th most senior officials of the Khmer Republic as traitors who had to be executed for their treason and who fomented a coup d'etat against Samdech Sihanouk and the 7 allies of the United States. And he caused the importation of the Vietnam War into Cambodia and the intensified bombings in Cambodia. 2. On that day in Tu Po Shrey, Khieu Samphan, the Pol Pot officials were in Tu Po Shrey and he supervised the massacre of soldiers at Tu Po Shrey. 3. Executions were committed in the commune in which Khieu Samphan was. 4. There are 2 minutes of the standing committee meeting of the 13th and 14th of March in which this policy was discussed. 5. Reports and telegrams were sent to Office 870 describing executions of former officials of the army. 6. There were some telegrams of secretaries from the North Zone regarding this issue. 7. After the victory, Khieu Samphan lived in Phnom Penh next to Pol Pot and other officials, and he was aware of everything and validated everything after the fact. 8. Khieu Samphan participated regularly in meetings of the Standing Committee at which zone leaders came to present reports on the security situation in their regions. 9. Kang Chap's telegram of September 1977 sent to Nunchia with Office 870 copied. 10. 2 speeches by Khieu Samphan from 1977 to 1978. 11. Testimony of Mies Van, which the prosecution asserts that were reported to Khieu Samphan. That is false. The prosecution claims that in 1978, let me remind the Chamber that we are talking of facts that were committed in April 1975. Kyo Sampan was powerful enough to cause the release of members of his in-laws family that Mias Von had arrested, among many other people. 12. There may have existed a decision dating back to June 1978 redefining the policy regarding the enemy members of the CIA. 13. There are interviews of Kyo Sampan that were granted in the 1980s, 1990s, 2000, and so on and so forth, in which he validates the policies of democratic Kampuchea. I will stop here. I will stop here because I am already wondering how many hours and how many pages I would need to respond to this crossfire of arguments that are completely unfounded. Now, the problem in this issue is that this strategy to stifle reflection obtains at all levels. It is exactly the same strategy that we have observed with the issues regarding population movements, phases 1 and 2. We are dealing with facts that have absolutely nothing to do with the trial. I will nevertheless try to sort out what is important in this jumble. There is no telegram regarding murders of the enemies and members of the Khmer Republic. These were never sent to Kyo Sampan throughout the period of democratic Kampuchea. Counsel for the prosecution, you will have many hours to respond to what I'm saying tomorrow. I would like you to come back to this hearing with a single telegram of the period regarding Tu Pochre or the period after informing Kyo Sampan of the murders or seeking his opinion or seeking to consult him. You have not a single telegram to that effect. Regarding the facts at Tu Pochre, you claim that those massacres were committed immediately after the 17th of April evacuations. Regarding events in 1976, 1977, 1978, several years after the facts, the chamber is seized of these facts several years later. You cannot content yourself with simply making inferences without providing evidence. And lastly, the only argument, and that is the argument that has been hammered the most on this issue, it is the issue regarding the radio communique signed by Kyo Sampan, adopted after a vote of the National Congress, which is supposed to have met on the 24th and 25th of February 1975. That is while the war against the Lon Nol regime was raging. That communique signed by Mr. Kyo Sampan, according to you, was the stamp of the agreement regarding the massacres committed at Tu Pochre, according to you, which you haven't established. Let us read an excerpt of this communique, dating back to February 1975, and which was read by the radio announcer of the Gronk Radio. It's document E3117, and I quote, "In these extremely favorable circumstances, the Great National Congress deliberated seriously and thoroughly for 2 days and issued pronouncements on various important matters, including the following. Concerning the 7 traitors in Phnom Penh, the National Congress has decided as follows: traitors Lon Nol, Sirik Matak, Songok Tang, Cheng Eng, Intam, Long Boret, and Sosten Fernandez are the chieftains of the traitors and ringleaders of the treacherous anti-national coup d'etat which overthrew the independence, peace, and neutrality of Cambodia. They are the ones who induced the U.S. imperialists to invade and set Cambodia aflame, bringing unprecedented, untold destruction and suffering to Cambodians and the death of many monks and people, including men, women, and children. On behalf of the NUFC, RGNUC, the CNLAF, the National Congress declares it's absolutely necessary to kill these 7 traitors for their treason against the nation and their fascist, corrupt, criminal sect, unprecedented in Cambodian history. As for other low or high-ranking government officials of various services, army officers, policemen of all categories, members of self-defense units, other armed units, politicians, high personalities, and all sorts of members in every organization of the traitors regime. On behalf of the Cambodian nation and people, the NUFC, the Funk and the Grunk, and the CPNLAF, the National Congress proclaims that these people have the full right to join the NUFC. I slow down, Mr. President. I'm speeding up because I provided the document, but I'll slow down. The Cambodian nation and the people, provided they immediately cease their service to the 7 traitors and stop cooperating with them. The nation and the Cambodian people, the Funk and the Grunk, will welcome and duly reward those army officers, troops, militiamen, policemen, functionaries, politicians, and high dignitaries in the areas under temporary army control who dare to oppose the traitors, fight them, and turn their weapons on them. For this reason, on behalf of the Cambodian nation and people, the NUFC, RGNUC, and CPNLAP, the National Congress appeals to the army officers, troops, police officers, policemen, militiamen, functionaries, politicians, and all other persons in the areas under the temporary enemy control to quickly abandon the 7 traitors who are now facing agony, to contribute to the activities of the people in Phnom Penh and other areas under temporary enemy control, and carry on the struggle against the traitors by seeking all available means to destroy their treacherous administrative apparatuses, military installations, police stations, armed depots, and so on and so forth. End of quote. First of all, what is obvious when we study this communique is that 2 of the 7 persons designated here as traitors were killed during the capture of Phnom Penh. The 5 others appear to have listened to the radio. It is interesting, first of all, to note that expert Short said that he doubted the fact that the February 1975 Congress really took place. He also stated that he is not aware that Keo Sampan was consulted before that communique, which he supposedly signed, was broadcast on the radio. That was a mere hint, because I don't want to flee from any debate. He doubted the veracity of those events. The communicated broadcast of the committee and the events are to portray the Gronk announcing the future execution of the 7 traitors who had overthrown Sihanouk, those responsible for the war for 5 years, those who had caused the war which led to the country that was bombarded the most in the history of humanity. So we are during the period of the war, and it is announced that the 7 persons responsible for that situation were going to be punished. Furthermore, we have, this is another aspect of the propaganda relating to this matter. There is nothing here that is particularly unusual in wartime. That was the opinion of Penut, Huyun, Hunim, and many others who echoed the contents of this text. It also echoes the opinion of Samdech Sihanouk himself, who, finding that the Grunk had been somewhat soft on this matter, softer than he would have liked to say, felt at liberty to issue or to deliver speeches in which, according to Samdech Sihanouk, more than 15 names were added to the initial list of 7 traitors. Are we charged with this? Quite on the contrary. We've seen the strength of the politicians who conquered the country from the traitors who had betrayed the country.
The President, thank you, Council. The time is now appropriate for a short break. The Chamber shall adjourn now and resume at 10 to 11. The Court is now adjourned.